It all started on a cold, gray afternoon, the kind of day where the sky hangs low and the air feels heavier than it should. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just killing time, really walking past rows of thrift stores lining the quieter part of town. Think you know how this story ends? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. There was this shop, tucked between a boarded-up bakery and an electronics store with flickering neon lights. I'd never noticed it before, and that felt strange. How many times had I walked this street? But there it was. A thrift shop with its windows half covered in faded posters advertising sales long expired. Inside, the air was stale like old paper and something metallic, maybe rust. Rows of shelves stood too close together, filled with mismatched teacups, dusty books, and cracked picture frames. It smelled like time itself had been trapped in there, slow and musty. I should have left then, but I didn't. There wasn't anyone at the counter. At least I didn't see anyone. Just this old bell on the counter. One of those you'd tap to call for help. I didn't touch it. Felt wrong to make a sound in that place. And that's when I saw it. The party hat, sitting crookedly on a mannequin's head in the corner, half hidden behind a stack of faded board games. Its colors had dulled with age, gold, blue, and red, all muted, like it had been drained of life. But what caught my eye was the stitching. Tiny, intricate patterns running along the brim, almost hypnotic. It looked handmade, but by someone who didn't care much for symmetry. I reached out to pick it up, and for a moment, I hesitated. I couldn't explain why, but my hand hovered there, just inches away. It was ridiculous, really. It's just a hat, I told myself. But as soon as I touched it, a strange chill ran up my arm. Not cold exactly, but sharp, brief, like a static shock that lingers longer than it should. Fit perfectly, which was odd, considering it looked too small at first glance. I caught my reflection in a dusty mirror leaning against the wall. Something about the way the hat sat on my head unsettled me. My reflection didn't look wrong exactly, but I don't know. The expression didn't feel like mine. Maybe it was just the warped glass. I should have left right then, walked out and forgotten about it. But instead, I carried it to the counter. A man appeared, so suddenly I almost flinched. I don't remember him walking in. Just there he was, behind the counter, as if he'd been waiting. He didn't say much, just gave me a price that was strange. Not high, not low, just strange. I paid, took the hat, and walked out. The air felt heavier when I stepped back outside, like the sky had dropped even lower. The hat was mine now, and somewhere deep inside, I knew that wasn't a good thing. When I got home, I placed the hat on the kitchen table and sat down, staring at it. It looked different under my apartment's light, less faded, almost like the colors had deepened overnight. The stitching glimmered faintly, catching light that didn't seem to be there. I shook my head, muttering to myself about how tired I was. "It's just a hat," I whispered, as though saying it out loud would make it true. The next morning, I had an odd urge to clean. I wasn't the tittiest person, but something about having the hat in the apartment made me restless. I started tidying the kitchen, scrubbing the counters and rearranging the dishes. All the while, the hat stayed exactly where I'd left it, yet I kept glancing at it, almost expecting it to move. By the time I left for work, I had convinced myself that the unsettling feeling was in my head. Maybe I wasn't used to buying secondhand things. Maybe the thrift shop had creeped me out more than I'd realized. But all day, I couldn't shake the thought of the hat sitting alone in my apartment, waiting. When I returned that evening, everything looked the same, except for one small detail. The hat was now on the floor, right in the middle of the living room. I froze. I hadn't moved it, I was sure of that. I didn't even own a pet that could have knocked it over. Slowly, I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The stitching seemed even more intricate now, like the patterns had grown. I shook off the thought and placed it back on the table, this time setting a heavy book on top of it for good measure. But that night, I couldn't sleep. My apartment felt alive, like it was breathing in sync with me. I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I wasn't imagining things. Finally, sometime past midnight, I drifted off. The next morning, the book was still on the table, but the hat wasn't there. Instead, it was on the arm of the couch, perched neatly as though someone had placed it there deliberately. My skin prickled. I didn't even want to touch it this time. That's when I noticed a small slip of paper poking out from under it, folded into a perfect square. I unfolded it, my hands trembling slightly. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar, and it simply said, "Rules are meant to be followed." I stared at the note, my mind racing. Rules? What rules? Was this someone's idea of a joke? But how could anyone have gotten into my apartment? My locks were fine and nothing else was out of place. I stuffed the note in a drawer and decided to put the hat in the closet, far away from where I could see it. I even locked the closet door, though it felt ridiculous to do so. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my routine, but it was impossible to focus. I kept thinking about that note. Who wrote it? And why? But what bothered me most was how it made me feel. Like I was being watched, even when I was alone. I finally broke down and went back to the thrift shop, hoping for answers. The shopkeeper was there this time, an older man with deep-set eyes and a voice that was too soft for comfort. I asked about the hat, trying to sound casual. He stared at me for a moment before saying, "That's not something you should have taken lightly." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "There are guidelines," he said, "for how it's used. You'll need to follow them." I pressed him for more details, but he wouldn't say anything else. Instead, he handed me another slip of paper, just like the one I'd found under the hat. This one had a list. Do not wear it more than once in a 24-hour period. Never let anyone else put it on. Keep it covered when it's not in use. I laughed nervously. "This is a joke, right?" The man didn't laugh. "You'll find out soon enough." When I got home, I sat with the list for hours, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about throwing the hat away, but something told me it wouldn't work. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to. As much as it scared me, it also intrigued me. That night, I followed the first rule. I put the hat on just for a moment and then took it off. Nothing happened at first, but then I noticed the mirror across the room. My reflection didn't match my movements. I blinked hard and the reflection blinked back, but not at the same time. It was slower, almost lazy, like it was mocking me. I took the hat off immediately and shoved it back into the closet, my heart pounding. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. And that's when I realized whatever was happening, it wasn't just about the hat anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the closet door locked and sat in the living room, staring at it like it might burst open at any moment. Nothing happened, of course, but the tension didn't fade. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, pressing down on me like an unseen hand. The next morning, I decided to leave the apartment early. I thought some fresh air and a walk might clear my head. I even left my phone at home, not wanting any distractions. The city was quiet, and the streets were mostly empty, a side effect of the holiday season. I tried to focus on the sound of my footsteps and the chill in the air, but my mind kept drifting back to the hat. When I returned, I noticed something odd right away. The closet door was slightly ajar. My stomach tightened. I knew I had locked it, double-checked in fact. My hands were shaking as I pulled the door open. The hat was still there, sitting on the shelf where I'd left it. But the slip of paper with the rules, it was gone. I tore through the closet, searching for it. It had to be there, couldn't just disappear. But no matter how thoroughly I looked, it was nowhere to be found. I sat back on my heels, my head spinning. The thought came unbidden. Maybe it wasn't meant to stay. I didn't want to touch the hat, but I couldn't help myself. My fingers brushed against the fabric, and for a split second, it felt warm. Not just warm, alive, like it was breathing beneath my touch. I pulled my hand back like I'd been burned. That's when I heard it. A faint creak coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I froze, every nerve in my body on edge. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen. When nothing did, I slowly moved toward the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, silent. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling, but the unease didn't fade. It followed me like a shadow, even as I locked the closet again and sat down at my kitchen table. That night, I dreamed about the hat. Or maybe I didn't. Felt more like something else. I saw myself standing in my living room, wearing it, but the reflection in the window wasn't me. It moved differently, slower, almost like it was watching me. When I woke up, my entire body was covered in sweat, and the closet door was wide open again. The next few days blurred together. I went to work, came home, and tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that clung to me. But the incidents didn't stop. Lights in my apartment flickered at odd intervals, and objects weren't where I remembered leaving them. I found my keys in the freezer one morning, though I hadn't been in the kitchen the night before. It was subtle at first. Small things that could be explained away if I tried hard enough. But then it started getting worse. One evening, I came home to find my living room window open. I never opened that window. It stuck so badly that I didn't even bother anymore. But there it was, wide open, with the curtains swaying gently in the breeze. I closed it quickly, trying to convince myself I must have forgotten. But as I reached for the latch, I noticed something on the windowsill. A faint, smudged handprint. It was too small to be mine. I barely slept that night, and when I finally drifted off, the dreams came back. This time, they were sharper, more vivid. I saw myself wearing the hat again, but I wasn't in my apartment. The walls were warped, the furniture wrong somehow, like it belonged to someone else. And there was a figure standing in the corner, just out of reach of the light. I couldn't see their face, but I felt their presence like a weight pressing against my chest. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there watching. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the hat. It was sitting on the coffee table in front of me, even though I was sure I'd locked it in the closet before going to bed. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The stitching looked different again, more intricate, almost like it was forming words. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the patterns seemed to shift under my gaze. I thought about throwing it out, tossing it in the dumpster behind the building and never looking back. But something stopped me. A voice in the back of my mind whispered, "It's too late for that now." By the end of the week, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. My reflection in the bathroom mirror didn't look quite right. It was too still, too calm, even when I was shaking. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway outside my door, but when I checked, there was no one there. I started hearing faint whispers, too soft to make out, like a distant conversation just out of reach. They came and went at odd times, when I was brushing my teeth, when I was lying in bed, when I was sitting alone in the living room, staring at the hat. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was tired, stressed. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was happening, it was only just beginning. By now, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. My days and nights blurred together, and my apartment felt less like home and more like a trap I couldn't escape. The hat sat on the coffee table, a silent presence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. I tried to stay out of the apartment as much as possible, spending hours at coffee shops, walking aimlessly through the city, or sitting in parks long after the sun went down. But every time I returned, the air inside felt colder, thicker, as though it had been waiting for me. And then one night something shifted. I was sitting on the couch, staring at the hat again, when the lights flickered once, then went out entirely. The room plunged into darkness, the kind that feels suffocating, like it's pressing against your skin. I reached for my phone, fumbling in the dark, and turned on the flashlight. The narrow beam of light swept across the room, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I told myself it was just a power outage, nothing to panic about, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible, coming from the hallway outside my apartment. It was soft at first, like the rustling of fabric or a faint shuffle of feet. Then it grew louder, more distinct, slow, deliberate footsteps. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for the knock that never came. Instead, the doorknob rattled gently, like someone was testing it. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up, moving as quietly as I could toward the door. I leaned against it, listening. The air felt electric, charged with something I couldn't name. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I exhaled shakily, backing away from the door. That's when I noticed it, the closet door. It was wide open. I hadn't touched it, hadn't gone near it since the last time I locked it. But now, it stood open, the shadows inside deeper than the darkness in the rest of the room. The hat was gone. My flashlight beam darted around the room, searching for it. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I realized it wasn't anywhere in sight. The coffee table was empty, the couch cushions undisturbed. And then I saw it. The hat was sitting on the windowsill, perfectly still, as though it had been placed there deliberately. I moved toward it slowly, my hands trembling. As I got closer, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The stitching, always intricate and shifting, now spelled out words. They were faint, but as I tilted the flashlight, they became clear. "Where me?" I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The beam of light spun wildly, illuminating the walls, the ceiling, the shadows that seemed to stretch and grow. Somewhere in the apartment, I heard a low, guttural sound. It wasn't human, not quite. Panic surged through me, and before I knew what I was doing, I grabbed the hat and put it on. The world shifted instantly. It wasn't like the dreams. This was sharper, more vivid, more real. The room around me dissolved, replaced by a vast, endless expanse of darkness. The floor beneath my feet felt solid, but I couldn't see it. Shapes moved in the distance, flickering in and out of view like shadows cast by an invisible light. They didn't make sense, too tall, too thin, too fragmented to be human. And then one of them turned toward me. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its attention, like a cold hand gripping my spine. It moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, until it was just a few feet away. "Why are you here?" a voice asked, though it didn't come from the figure. It was everywhere and nowhere, echoing in my mind. I don't know, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head, as though considering me. "You shouldn't have come." "I didn't mean to," I said, my voice cracking. I don't understand what's happening." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out, its hand long and skeletal, and pointed to something behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind me stood a mirror, tall and ornate, its surface rippling like water. The reflection wasn't me. It was wearing the hat, but its face was wrong. The features were twisted, distorted, like a bad memory half forgotten. It smiled at me, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach its eyes. "Take it off," the voice said. I hesitated, my hands trembling as I reached for the hat. But before I could touch it, the figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming. "Take it off," the voice repeated, sharper this time. I grabbed the brim of the hat and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. Felt like it was fused to my skin, a part of me now. The reflection in the mirror began to laugh, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the darkness. "Take it off," the voice demanded, now angry, desperate. I pulled harder, tears streaming down my face as I fought against the hat. And then, with one final, desperate tug, it came free. The world snapped back into focus. I was on the floor of my apartment, the hat in my hands. The lights were back on, and the room was silent. But the sense of unease lingered, heavier than ever. I stared at the hat, my chest heaving. The stitching was gone, the patterns faded. It looked like nothing more than an old, worn-out party hat. But I knew better. I shoved it into a box, taped it shut, and threw it in the farthest corner of the closet. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. It's been weeks since that night. I've done everything I can to forget, to move on. I sealed the hat in a box, taped it shut, and shoved it to the back of my closet. Sometimes I think about burning it, but then I wonder, would that really get rid of it? I've tried to convince myself it's just an object, that everything that happened was in my head. Stress, lack of sleep, maybe even some kind of hallucination. That's what I tell myself on the good days. But then there are the other days. On those days, I hear faint noises when the apartment is supposed to be silent. A soft creak, the sound of something brushing against the walls. I tell myself it's nothing, but deep down I know better. I've started avoiding mirrors. It sounds ridiculous, but I can't help it. Every time I catch my reflection, I brace myself for something to be wrong. Most of the time, it's fine. Just me staring back. But sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see something, just a flicker of movement, a split-second delay, like it's waiting for me to notice. I barely sleep anymore. When I do, the dreams are still there, though they've changed. Now, it's not the hat I see. It's the figure in the shadows. Always watching, always waiting. And then there's the box. I've checked it more times than I care to admit, just to make sure it's still sealed. Each time, I hold my breath, half expecting it to be open, the hat gone. But it's always there, exactly as I left it. At least it was until yesterday. When I got home from work, the closet door was open again. The box was sitting in the middle of the room, the tape perfectly intact. I didn't touch it, couldn't. That night, I heard a knock at my door. Just one. Quiet, almost polite. I didn't answer. I didn't even move. This morning, when I finally opened the door, there was nothing there. No package, no note. Just an empty hallway. But when I turned back to my apartment, I saw it. The hat. Sitting on the coffee table, just as it had been that first night. I don't know how it got there. I don't know what it wants. And I don't know if I'll ever be free of it. Ready for more chills and mysteries? Subscribe and turn on the bell. You never know what story is coming next.